I'm Shelah Gilbert Leader.
And tell us when and where you were born, please.
I was born December 26, 1943 in Brooklyn, New York.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your family and what kind of family you grew up in? Any special circumstances?
I was fortunate to grow up in a nuclear family. I'm the oldest of 3 girls, and I come from a fairly long line of scholars on both sides of my family. So I think I picked up very early that there was a huge amount of respect for learning, for scholarship, that those who had doctorates were particularly esteemed. And I was always being told by relatives, particularly adoring grandmother and great aunt, that I was smart, had an inquiring mind that was unusual for a very young child. And so I think that formed my early identity. And I loved reading. I don't remember playing with dolls. I just remember loving school and loving learning.
So you had a good beginning and lots of confidence in you from the other women in your family, it sounds like.
Yes, I think I was fortunate to have very strong, very loving, atypical older generation of women. And I think from a very, very young age, I always knew I wanted a career. And I think I was unconsciously always trying to find, well, what could I do besides be a secretary, a nurse, a librarian, or an elementary school teacher? Those were the only role models that I saw. And I knew I wanted to do something different, but I didn't know what.
So at what point did you become aware of the women's movement or get involved, and how did it affect you? Yeah.
It really began when I was enrolled as a graduate student at SUNY at Buffalo, which was a rapidly growing and very well funded project of Governor Rockefeller. And I transferred there at the suggestion of my then boyfriend from Hebrew University, where I was pursuing graduate work, got a free ride, and as soon as I arrived, I was waylaid in the ladies' room by the only 2 women junior faculty in the political science department, who said to me that the department was hopelessly prejudiced against women, that they were being denied money to present research at professional meetings, that they intended to both leave the university, and they urged me to leave too. I was stunned. I had just arrived. I had a full fellowship and needed money to pursue my studies, and I thought, what am I going to do? And their judgment was rapidly proved to be correct. It was a very unwelcoming environment on the part of the faculty, who were all male. And so one day when I walked into the student union, there was a banner strung across the hallway, suspended from the ceiling, and it announced the formation of something called the Women's Liberation Movement. I had no idea what that was, but I knew I was going to go. And I did go to meetings which were very informal. Anybody could drop in. We were all on a first-name basis. And it was basically a study group. We were reading the canon of women's liberation literature, starting with John Stuart Mill and Frederick Engels and going on down.
Amazing.
I don't know how I learned about it, but I also joined a consciousness raising group, which was electrifying. We had never talked about such things before.
Was that in the community or at the campus?
That was off campus, but I suspect almost everybody there, one way or another, was affiliated with the university. And one day when I was at the Women's Liberation Movement meeting, somebody said that something called Now was having an organizing meeting and that we should all go and find out what it was about. I had no idea. But I was curious, so I went.
Can you tell me what year this was, just to place us in
I'm
time?
not sure if it was 1967 or 68. It was something like that.
Very
And of
early.
course, it was the height of the anti-war movement. Campuses were aboil with ferment. It was a very exciting time to be on campus. So the now meeting, as best I remember, took place, I think, in a classroom one evening. And the organizers who greeted those who arrived were older than I, and they seemed to be mostly junior faculty women.
Okay.
There were some men, there were some husband and wife couples, as well as wives of faculty members. And they talked about the purposes of NOW and said we should elect officers. And to my surprise, I was elected president of NOW.
That was a little more than you bargained for when you left home, huh?
I think everybody was surprised. But that really became the focus of my activism during the period of my graduate student work in Buffalo until about 1970-71.
Okay.
We really accomplished a huge amount. Among the things we did was we persuaded the editors of the two major newspapers to de-sex the help wanted ads, because for those who don't know, all the better paying jobs were under the help wanted male column.
Right.
We also lobbied our state legislators to try to persuade them to vote in favor of decriminalizing abortion, because it was a crime at that point in New York State.
Right.
We also found out from women in the community who came to some of our meetings that an illegal abortion in the area costed $1,200, which was a year's income to us. So we started an illegal telephone hotline to refer women to safe and affordable abortions over the border in Canada.
Right.
We also found out and decided to act on the fact that the student health service on campus would not provide any gynecologic services to female students. They were told they had to go find a doctor in the community, get there on their own dime.
Right.
But the health service had a full suite of orthopedic services for the athletes.
Amazing.
So we confronted them and said, this will not do. We demand parity, and we got it.
Wonderful.
Ann Scott, who was one of the founding members of our chapter, found out that the campus received federal funds and by law needed to have an affirmative action plan, which it did not have.
Right.
So she wrote one
Oh,
and presented it to the university authorities and said, either improve on it or this is the plan. She then went on later to the National Now and became a very effective head of policy work. She was dynamo.
she was.
We tried to get a daycare center established. This was an eye-opening experience. We reached out to the Early Childhood Education Department and asked if they would consider organizing a daycare center for students and faculty. They said, come talk to us. And I went as the representative of NOW. Some other women I had never met before went too, and they said, it's our way or no way. We have to run it and have final say on everything having to do with the daycare center, or it's no-go. And the faculty with whom we were meeting said, well, the only reason we can support this is as a training ground for our students who are training in early childhood education.
Right.
Otherwise, there's no educational component and we can't back it. And the extremists said, forget it. And I thought, wow,
Mm-hmm.
watch out for ideologues who would
Interesting.
rather
Right.
jeopardize the broader interests of women rather than compromise.
So there was a political education for Shelah on
Oh,
that
yes.
action.
I was horrified that they would do that.
So did all of it broke down and
Yeah,
it didn't happen?
that was the end of the meeting.
Wow.
Also, one of the things that I learned that I wasn't able to work on then, but I did later, is one of the faculty wives who was working on her doctorate in English literature at what was then considered to be one of the foremost departments of English literature at the time, said, there's never been a woman who got tenure in this department. The vast majority of students are female, and you can get a doctorate in English literature without ever reading a work by a female author.
Amazing.
We need to do something about making sure that women's perspectives and women's research get integrated into the curriculum here. And that was an aha moment for me.
Yes.
When I finished my doctoral work at Buffalo, I moved to Ithaca, New York,
Okay.
and met with
What was your field of study?
political science. I
Okay.
got a PhD in political science. It was awarded in 1971,
Okay.
and I could not get a tenure track job as a political scientist. I was able to get, gigs to teach a course here, a course there, but no tenure track jobs. And when I was in Ithaca, I met with an ongoing group of women who, like me, had advanced degrees and were plotting how could we get a women's studies program, a formal one,
I see.
established at Cornell.
Okay.
And we met and discussed it for a while as we thought about what would such a program look like ideally. And I was designated by the group eventually to go meet with the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Cornell. I think his name was Fred Kahn, who was really quite a nice guy. He agreed to meet with me, and we presented the idea, and he said, sounds like a good idea to me, I'm willing to sign off on it.
Really?
And so...
Were you there as a now person or as just an individual?
Just
concern?
an individual
Okay.
with a PhD
Wow,
who
okay. Right. That's interesting.
had some ideas
That's
about
interesting,
things
yeah.
that could be taught.
Right.
And so the program was formally established. Jenny Farley was the first coordinator, I think her title was. I went to the Cornell Political Science Department and proposed 2 courses that I designed. I asked would they give it credit to political science as a cross-listed course with the Women's Studies program, and I taught the 2 courses and served on the advisory committee for this program, I guess for a year or 2, I can't remember. And it was really a joy.
Right.
And then in 1970...
Must have been one of the early...
It was
women's
very early.
studies
It was very
courses.
early. I taught a course on women in the Chinese Revolution
Oh my goodness.
and published one of the first articles on the subject in World Politics, which is available online. And I also taught a course on American women in policy or politics. I can't remember the exact title.
Right.
And then in 1973, I learned that there was an opening to go to the Center for the American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute. Ruth Mandel brought me there. So I moved for a year to Eagleton, and it happened to be an election year. And so I designed a study to interview all of the women who are running for election to the New Jersey State Legislature.
Fabulous.
And I designed a questionnaire and I interviewed them as well as their male competitors.
Okay.
And it was really an interesting
I'll bet.
experience for me. I found that the women's motives and the way they ran their campaigns was dramatically different from that of the men. And that study was also published.
Good.
And then in 1974, I moved to Washington, D.C. and got a job in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department on the strength of my work in civil rights.
Excellent.
But I really wanted to work on women's issues. And as soon as I got to D.C., I started making the rounds of all the women's organizations, introducing myself, and putting the word out that my passion was women's issues, and asked them to think of me if any openings would come along. And soon after I started work at the Justice Department, I was invited to be part of a lunchtime panel talk. I don't even remember what the subject was. Probably I talked about my research and my work. And at the end of the panel, Bella Abzug's administrative assistant came up to me and I guess thanked me for the talk. And I said, well, I really want to go back and work on women's issues. If you hear of anything, please let me know. I think it was just a few weeks later, she called me and said, Bella wants to meet you. She has a job for you.
Oh, my goodness.
But I had no idea what it was.
Yeah, of course.
And I was heavily pregnant with my first child at the time.
Okay.
And so after work, I went up to the Hill to meet with Bella, who I'd never met before. And she said, I didn't even know what the job was. And she said, how soon can you start?
Really?
And I said, well, my due date is September 20th, and I'm taking 6 weeks of maternity leave. Now, there was no maternity leave in those days. I had spent a year saving up all my vacation and sick leave. And she screamed at me, 6 weeks? What do you need 6 weeks for? I had a cesarean section, was in court a week later.
Okay. Now we have a different kind of boss, yes.
And I timidly said, well, I'm sorry, but I really think I need
Good for you.
that time. And I thought, oh, there goes the job. And she said, all right. I said, well, where's the job? And she jerked her finger over her shoulder and said, there, Lee, her administrative assistant, will tell you about it.
Oh, funny.
So the job was with the National Commission on the Observance of International Women's Year. And so 6 weeks to the day after I gave birth, I presented myself to the State Department where they had initially had offices. And that began, I think, the most exciting and fun job I've ever had. And it entailed working with Catherine East of blessed memory in the Policy and Plans Department. Initially, I staffed a committee of the 4 members of Congress.
Could you name them?
Yes, they were Bella Abzug, Peggy Heckler, were the 2 members from the House of Representatives, and the senators were, oh golly, he just died. Birch Bayh and Chuck Percy. Chuck Percy.
From Illinois.
They were all lovely.
Yes.
They were all lovely.
Those were lovely people.
And Bella was chair of the committee, and she wanted to get the commission to support her proposal for a cabinet-level department on women's affairs. And I, at her direction, had to write a proposed bill, which she introduced in Congress, but it never really went anywhere. So we worked on the first report to the president to form a more perfect union. And then Bella, at the same time, got a bill passed calling for meetings, public meetings in every state and territory leading up to the Houston Conference in 1977, which I thrilled to work on, and which led us to 2 years later, Pat Hyatt, who was one of my colleagues on the commission, and I wrote American Women on the Move, our insider story about those state and national meetings, because we were worried that it would be lost to history.
Yes, you
but I
should
think
worry.
people are learning about it now. So this was our
Very
effort to make sure
valuable resource.
that the story would be told. After the commission expired, I started doing consulting work with Ellie Smeal, then still president of NOW. I also taught a course at the Women's Studies program at George Washington University. I'm trying to think what else I did. I forgot to say that when I was in Ithaca, I was the national treasurer of the Women's Caucus of the American Political Science Association, because we wanted to make sure there were opportunities for women scholars to present their research at national and regional political science meetings, because the guys would never give us a chance to talk about our research. What else? While I was in Washington, I also was the chairwoman of the Montgomery County chapter of NOW's Task Force on Insurance Discrimination.
So you joined NOW in the Montgomery County chapter.
Did that. We really tried very hard to persuade the Maryland legislature to forbid insurance policies that were permitted in the state to use gender as a basis for setting rates. That was a tough nut to go up against the insurance industry. I continued to do research relating to women, mostly on health-related issues. But I also joined with my then husband and Shelah Tobias. We wrote a book trying to demystify strategic doctrine and weapons in order to empower women to feel confident that they could have a say on important issues in national defense.
What was the name of that book?
It was What Kinds of Guns Are They Buying for Your Butter?
Excellent.
And it came out in hardback and in paperback. And then when I went to work for AARP, and national health insurance was once again being discussed.
What year was that?
It was in the early 1980s.
Okay.
I wrote a book supported by AARP that talked about various proposals to reform our health insurance system, including national health insurance as one option. And then I continued to write an awful lot of both popular and peer-reviewed scientific articles on health and women's health, culminating 2 years ago in what kind of the American Women on the Move.
Things.
I think certainly we now in Buffalo was really path-breaking. I forgot to say that one of the things we did is, as president, I was able to do a lot of TV and radio interviews to get the word out within the community about what is the women's movement about.
Right.
And one of the things I did was I invited the leaders of every women's organization in Buffalo to come to a meeting, which I think we held at the YMCA. And I told them about the goals of NOW. And I asked them whether or not there were any issues that they thought their organization and now could collaborate on.
Good for you.
And there was thundering silence.
I'll bet.
And I thought, oh, we've got a lot of work to do. There's a lot of education to be done.
Right.
But if I think about that experience, which was probably around 1970, and what happened when we held the meetings in every state and territory
Right. Talk
in
about that.
1977.
You're drawing a very important distinction, I think, and so talk about the state meetings. Talk more about the IWI and its how it worked and what happened.
It was just life-altering and thrilling experience, because women by 1977, all the public opinion polls showed that the vast majority of women and men supported most of the top line goals of the women's movement, including the Equal Rights Amendment and Roe v. Wade and equal pay for equal work and Title IX and equal credit. So when the word got out that there was going to be a meeting open to every resident in every state and territory, we were overwhelmed by the numbers of people who came.
Yes.
It was just more than we expected, and often bigger than the space that we had rented could allow. In New York State, I think 14,000 women came.
Amazing.
In a broiling hot day. I was the federal representative for the New Jersey meeting, which was held on the campus at Princeton. I was there to make sure that the meeting was run in accordance to the rules, because this was a federally funded event. And was shocked that women who were opposed to the goals of the meeting came with whistles, which they blew non-stop to try to make it impossible for debate to take place. And I thought, they're so undemocratic. They have an opportunity to state their case, but they don't want to engage in debate. They don't believe in democratic processes. They must know that they're in the minority, and they'll do anything to keep us from having our say and voting openly. And I think we didn't realize it then, but it was a foretaste of what we're living with now, of anti-democratic forces that don't believe in majority rule. But it was thrilling, and while I'm certainly disheartened by much of what's happening politically now, I think that for young women, the Me Too movement, for sure, got the attention of many young women who were beneficiaries of all the hard work women of my generation did, took those rights for granted, and would say things like, well, I'm not a feminist, but we don't hear that now. And that makes me happy.
Yes.
And among the things that I'm enjoying doing now as a volunteer for the League of Women Voters is registering high school students to vote.
Excellent.
Especially since Parkland.
Excellent.
The kids understand the importance of participating and the levers of democracy. And they don't have to be persuaded. And suddenly high schools are starting to talk about the importance of civics education. And as a political scientist, that makes me very happy. It's time.
It's time.
Time to come back
It definitely is.
to the basics.
Right. So I think you answered this in a way, but I'll ask it explicitly. The women's movement had a tremendous impact, apparently, on your professional development as well as your personal development.
Absolutely.
Do you want to talk about that?
Well, it gave me confidence to understand that the unfairness, the discrimination that I experienced professionally was not my fault, that it was because of institutionalized sexism, and the way to deal with it is by joining forces with other women and taking action and calling it out when we experienced it, and that when one door closes, another opens, and that while my career wasn't what I thought I was setting out to have, I've had an extraordinarily rewarding career. I've seen enormous and gratifying changes, that every generation of women will have to fight different battles, that the things that I fought for are not the issues that my daughter, who is a proud feminist and has started her own organization, and is an author too. So I see the next generation moving forward proudly.
Excellent.
As a feminist. And she's now passing those lessons on to my young grandchildren, who get to see her campaigning for election and public speaking and doing me proud.
Excellent. Is she running for office?
She is indeed. She's a candidate for election to her town council in Westchester.
Beautiful.
And she's also the co-founder and CEO of an organization called All In Together, which is a nonpartisan organization aiming to give women the tools for empowerment using the levers of power.
Beautiful.
So I see the next generation moving forward and fighting the battles again. So it's very satisfying to me.
Excellent. So the personal is political and the political is personal.
Absolutely. My daughter was raised listening to Proud to Be You and Me, the record. And she's giving those lessons on to the next generation.
That's wonderful.
I'm delighted that Veteran Feminists of America exists, that you are doing this video history. I guess the last thing I'll say is that my Now and Other Feminist papers are at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe. That a lot of my papers and peer-reviewed articles are available on the internet, and that I hope to continue the battle.